We're going to do a quick overview of what was covered in Lesson 4 on the War of 1812. First, we'll start with the slideshow that we began in Lesson 3 and just do a quick overview of the reasons that the war started. The first reason had to do with the Treaty of Paris that was the ending of the War of Independence. Essentially, both sides had made promises to the other and hadn't kept them. Britain had not given the Americans the Ohio Valley, and the Americans had not compensated the Loyalists for the land and property that they'd taken prior to or during the war. There was also the First Nations alliance that had been made. They had begun to fight back against the Americans. The Americans did defeat the First Nations alliance. However, the Americans were kind of miffed with the British because they felt that the First Nations had been able to fight them, as in fight the Americans, because they felt the British had given them weapons. The British said, no, that wasn't us, but the Americans still felt that it was. And then here are the big reasons. Because Britain was in war with France, Britain wasn't letting any foreign ships into their harbor. So if we pretend someone had this ship here, they were sending it from the United States over to Britain. They can't sell their goods to Britain anymore because Britain won't let them in. They're worried there might be spies on that ship, or they might get information from the harbor while they're there. So now the trade the U.S. previously had with Britain is gone, and their economy is hurting because they can't sell their stuff. Up in British North America, where we now are as Canada, they're going to buy lots of stuff from us because they aren't trading with the U.S. anymore. So it's great for us, really bad for the U.S. To add further insult, when the British were boarding the American ships and telling them they needed to turn around and go back home, they also looked for people that they felt were deserters from the military, and they claimed those people back. Those people might have felt that they were American, so the Americans are really upset that British were taking their people, and the British felt that they were completely entitled to take those people. Those things led to the war. But then there's the actual war itself. So at that point, we pause in our slideshow, and we come way down here to this reenactment script, and I'll kind of summarize it. I'll skip through things. So first, we started off with Jefferson, who announced that he was going to start this war against Britain. He recapped the reasons they were really upset with Britain and willing to start a war, but he said a few key things. So first, he says, the time has come to free our neighbors to the north from the oppression of British rule. As in, up here in Canada, we've got an awful king, and he's going to free us from that awful king. He also points out that they are 16 times the size of British North America. Yeah, the population in the U.S. is way larger than our population up here, which is a little daunting going into a war. He also states that there are those among our northern neighbors who not so long ago belonged to our country and will surely want to join in our cause. Well, it just so happens that a lot of those people left the U.S. for a reason. We're not so interested in joining them. So that was a little bit of a misunderstanding on his part. Then there's this phrase that is a direct quote from what he said. He said that taking control of British North America will be a mere matter of marching. As in, this is going to be a snap. They're just going to march up here, take over, and that's all there is to it. It'll be totally simple. Well, there were some other perspectives to take into account here. So this Redcoat 1 is representing a British perspective from someone living up here in British North America. And this person is pointing out that they had left because of the way they were treated during the rebellions. Perhaps their father was harassed and beaten. They decided to escape. The journey was not easy, and starting a new farm was not easy, and therefore they're going to stay loyal to Britain. They've gone through so much because the rebels forced them out. They're not feeling loyal to the rebels. They're feeling loyal to Britain, who welcomed them when they needed a new home. Then we have another perspective here of the Americans. So although Jefferson said, we're really upset, we want war, this person down here is pointing out that not all Americans did want war. This person was a merchant, and because those ships were being searched and turned around, this merchant did not have business with the Americans anymore. So instead, this merchant did not have business with the British anymore. So they needed to find someone else to buy their goods, and they've actually been selling to the Maritimes. So New Brunswick, we'll say, for example, which means that they've got a new buyer and business is okay. It's not great, but they're getting by. Well, New Brunswick is part of British North America. So if a war is started with British North America, then this person, again, is losing their business. This is not a good decision for them, and they've just been through a war with the American Revolution. They're not so keen on the idea of war again. The Mohawk perspective here, this one is just showing that the First Nations people weren't really, they were not interested in war. However, the Americans had been fighting them and taking their land. The British had not been quite that aggressive, so the First Nations were looking at two bad options, side with the Americans or side with the British. They didn't really trust either one, but they trusted the Americans even less than they trusted the British, so it was the better of the two bad options. The Mohawk or the other First Nations groups, they joined the British in the hopes that at the end of the war, they would be awarded some land for all of their fighting efforts. Brock down here, he is one of the key leaders on the side of the British. He was very charismatic. He had one of those personalities where people wanted to listen to him. They believed in him. He inspired them to do things, which is great because we're seriously outnumbered. So let's skip to the Battle of Michilimackinac and the Battle of Detroit. So Brock knew that years of conflict between the American posts and a variety of First Nations groups, especially in the Ohio Valley, had created an American fear of Aboriginal warfare, as in the Americans grew up with scary stories about the First Nations people. And even though they're grown up now, they've still got this conception, this idea in their mind that the First Nations warriors are absolutely terrifying. He also knew that the American army, while larger, was mostly volunteers, so they're not as well trained. Brock's forces were both volunteer and regular British soldiers, and the British army still maintained a reputation of being fierce. So despite having fewer troops, guns, and equipment, Brock set about making the best of his circumstances. And I'm going to read you this because it sums up things pretty well. This is an idea of Brock's strategy put into common language today. He says to his team, okay, here's what we're going to do. First, make sure that every single red uniform that we have is being worn. It doesn't matter if the man wearing it is a soldier or a volunteer. We want the Americans to think that we have more trained soldiers than we actually do. Because, our reputation is pretty strong. It's going to be intimidating. Second, you are going to travel to Michilimackinac with a message saying that we don't need reinforcements because 5,000 First Nations warriors are coming to join our forces. With any luck, the Americans will capture you, that messenger, and read the message and become really scared. We actually only have 6 Mohawk joining us, but they don't need to know that. So Brock's strategy is to make the Americans think that we are much stronger than we actually are. Because they don't have things like satellite images back then. They don't have any additional information besides the impressions that they get. And if they think that there's a lot of trained soldiers and a whole lot of scary First Nations warriors, then they might be prompted to surrender. Well, what happened? The British won. Then they went on to a battle at Detroit, where Brigadier General William Hull just crossed the border into Upper Canada. He actually said, this is a direct quote, "You will be emancipated from tyranny and oppression and restored to the dignified state of freedom. I come prepared for every contingency. I have a force which will look down on all opposition." Translated into common language today, you will be freed from the awful rule of your terrible king, and we will make you free from that king. I come prepared for every single problem. It's like I've got plan A, B, C, D, maybe even E, F, and G. I'm so totally prepared. And I have a force which will look down upon all obstacles. So you can't stand in my way. I will get through. Well, Brock steps up with strategy. He sends Tecumseh across the river in the dark to spread out and surround the American fort. And then, when the battle started, they ran around the outside so it looked like there were lots more of them, and they made a lot of noise in order to intimidate the Americans and think that there were tons of First Nations warriors. Well, Hull surrendered Detroit almost without a fight because of that strategy of Brock's. It was very intimidating. And let's admit, the First Nations have one heck of a reputation, so that was a big factor. So at this point, the Americans had thought that this was going to be pretty simple, marching and taking British North America. With Brock's strategy, they've been able to intimidate the Americans into surrendering twice in a row at some pretty big battles. So at this point, the Americans are pretty ticked off that it's not going as well as they wanted, and they're a little upset with their leaders suggesting that it was going to be so easy. The British, however, are really happy with Brock, and our morale is boosting because we're realizing that even though we're really outnumbered, we're actually managing to hold off the Americans. Then there's a battle on the Niagara frontier. Those of you who have been down to Niagara Falls, it's that area. Brock has spread out his troops along the Niagara frontier, but we're pretty thin. It's a really long distance to cover, and we don't have that many people. The reason we really want to defend that area is because it's where we're so close to the U.S. It's a very easy place for the U.S. to cross and attack us. Well, they have planned to attack. They're sending over 3,000 troops from New York to Queenston Heights. We only have 300 British soldiers defending Queenston. So Brock comes riding in with reinforcements as soon as he hears the shots. But as he's leading his forces up the hill, he's shot. Legend has it that he urged his followers on even after being shot, but judging by the evidence, experts have decided that he did die instantly. Although you could say his powerful leadership certainly spurred the British on to victory that day. Now that claim of victory is somewhat debatable because yes, 3,000 troops of Americans versus 300 British soldiers, yeah, we didn't have luck in our pockets. However, it was kind of a two-part battle, and depending on your interpretation, you might say the British won one part of that battle and the Americans won the other part. And then we're Canadians, we tend to say that we won some of that. After Brock's initial victories, the battles went back and forth. So if you did the Where Are You in History game with me, where we read this letter of an American soldier about the battle at York, which we call the Burning of York, that's where there was a long fuse lit, and because the British were so severely outnumbered, they planned a retreat, but they blew up the magazine with that long fuse. The magazine being the building that has all of the gunpowder and other ammunitions in it. And that huge explosion took out a lot of American soldiers, but it also really made them grumpy. They were not happy about that explosion, so they went through York, which is currently called Toronto, and they burnt down a lot of the buildings. So the Americans won that, but it was one of those things that stuck in the British minds because so many buildings were burnt down. It was pretty nasty defeat. Then there's beaver dams. If you've ever heard of Laura Secord, The Americans, some of the leaders, went into her house and said, hey, we're going to sleep here tonight and you're going to serve us supper. This is now our post. Well, seeing as it's just her and her kids there, she can't really say no to it. But as she's serving them supper, they talk about their battle plans. She hears it and wants to warn the British because she doesn't want the British to be caught unaware of this attack. She traveled a long distance on her own in order to warn the British. She was able to warn them. They planned a First Nations ambush of the Americans, and therefore the British won Beaver Dams. Lake Erie, there's another battle, and around there it's where Tecumseh dies. That's a big blow to the British because the First Nations warriors were following Tecumseh. They were not following the British. And therefore, when Tecumseh died, we lost all of the First Nations warriors. That really weakens the British fighting strength. So now it's going back and forth. At Chateauguay, British win. Chrysler's Farm, British win. Chippewa, Americans win. Fort Erie, Americans win. But then the war over in Europe changes. They're no longer fighting, which means they can send over, because the war has ended there, they can send British troops over to strengthen our troops. So now British are winning more consistently. After a whole bunch of wins, the British kind of get high on their success and they go down and they invade Washington and burn down a lot of their buildings, the White House included. Remember how at the beginning of this, there were some Americans who were not thrilled about the war? Well, now they're really not thrilled. This was supposed to be easy. The war started in 1812. It's now 1814, and the British are starting to win more of the battles. So they decide to sign a treaty. Just when they go to sign that treaty, it happens over in Britain, and the message that the treaty has been signed doesn't get back all the way across the ocean to us very quickly. And there's a final battle in the Battle of New Orleans. And at that battle, the Americans do win. The American interpretation is that they won the last battle and therefore they won the war. Seeing as no land was lost, there's some weight to that interpretation. However, in our interpretation up here, the Americans were the ones who started the war in order to take control of our land, and we defended our borders. And again, no land was lost because we defended those borders. Obviously, there was a lot of people's lives that were lost. So there's definitely loss in the war. But as far as land being transferred, there was no land transfer. So in Lesson 3, you filled in the American perspective and the British perspective for the reasons that the war started. Other key ideas, you can select quite a number of them from the lesson that we just went over here. You could talk about Laura Seacord's role in the Beaver Dams battle. You could talk about the importance of Tecumseh and the impact of his death. You can talk about how when the war over in Europe ended, we had a lot of British reinforcements, which allowed us to strengthen our stand in the war. You could talk about the burning of York or the burning of Washington. Any ideas that you feel are important, maybe even how outnumbered we were, or Brock's strategy. Any ideas that you feel were important from the War of 1812 and its various battles. Over here, you need to talk about how the First Nations people were treated during and following the war. And as you explain why they were treated that way, hopefully you can connect in some of the social attitudes of that time. So if you remember, back then, the British felt that the First Nations were uncivilized, when in truth it was simply that the cultures had different, the cultures were different. So the standards that the British had for interaction or for the way they dressed or for the way they ate or all those sorts of things, they were different than the First Nations. They were not better, but at that time, the British believed that their social standards were better and therefore that they were more civilized. However, during the war, the First Nations people were a great asset to the British. In fact, if we didn't have them, I suspect that this would not be Canada today. It would be the US, because their fighting prowess was key to Britain being able to defend their borders. So that at that time, they were treated with respect, and you could also say a little bit of fear, because they were still intimidating and they were different. And there's often a lot of fear associated with the unknown, the differences, the impressions that people make, right? So the First Nations people were treated with respect and some fear in order to show that their asset, their value was appreciated in the war, because we needed them on our side. However, after the war, that value as warriors was no longer there. The war was done, and that meant that they were no longer needed, and they didn't have anything else of value to Britain at that time, because what they had, Britain didn't need. So after the war, the promises made to the First Nations people were not kept. You could also say that that's in part because the First Nations warriors left the war when Tecumseh died, but the promises were not kept because the British did not feel that they needed to. There was no reason as far as value goes, so as far as strategic reason, it didn't exist anymore. And they also did not view the First Nations people as being equal, because human rights hadn't reached the level that it has today. And therefore, they didn't feel the need to honor their promise because of those social values back then.